You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we're thrilled to be joined today by Carol Costello, journalist and true crime podcaster. Carol, thank you for joining us today on Mind Over Murder.
Oh, I'm still getting used to the true crime podcaster thing.
Welcome to the club.
I'm so thrilled to be on your show. Thank you for inviting me.
We are so thrilled to have you. Can you start just by telling anyone who's unfamiliar a little bit about yourself and your professional background?
Oh, man, I was a professional journalist for 35 years, which seems incredible to me. For 20 of those years, I spent at CNN, where I was a national correspondent and anchor. And I loved CNN. And I know it's in a precarious state right now, but a lot of good people over there. But I did enjoy my career there, and I learned a lot. I left in 2018. And I teach journalism at Loyola Marymount University, and I also produce a true crime podcast. I also have created a program for student journalists to cover the presidential election of 2024 with an emphasis on civil discourse. So they're out there working right now.
Bravo. Yeah, I love that.
That's fantastic. And I've read how many presidents you have interviewed. It's a lot. You've really had a lot of FaceTime with people who are holding the office of president or would like to hold the office of president. So that's got to be an interesting program in and of itself.
Oh, yeah. I covered 5 or 6 presidential elections and inaugurations. And I worked for the Wolf Blitzer show for a while. So I was a political reporter, which was very interesting. In 2016, I covered politics quite extensively, which was really interesting.
Yeah.
But it's hard to say that you enjoy covering politics, because that's not exactly the right word. But it's always fascinating because it really gives you a sense of the state the country's in. And I find that to be amazing.
Let me ask a question then. Would you rather cover hard news than political stuff?
I consider politics hard news because it's just, it should be serious. It should have meaning. It shouldn't just be about the insults that politicians trade. It should have a deeper meaning. So I always tried to concentrate on that kind of political reporting. When I was a young reporter coming up through local, I always covered crime. I had the court beat and the police beat. So I went down to the police department every morning and I went through the police reports. And then if a big crime would happen, I would cover the case from the investigation stage through the trial. So I did that when I was a local reporter. And I became an investigative reporter when I hit Washington, D.C. And I did all kinds of stuff then, which was interesting.
I know I'm asking what is probably going to be a massively complex question to answer, but let's go ahead and give it a shot here. Over the course of this amazing journalistic career that you've had, you have covered a lot of stories. Are there any ones that jump out at you immediately as being so compelling, you feel absolutely thrilled and privileged to have covered them?
Oh, so many. The one at CNN that really stands out to me oddly, there was a young reporter who was shot to death while she was doing a live report on television.
Oh, yeah.
Was it in Roanoke? I remember that.
Yeah. Yes.
Allison Parker, yeah.
Parker. We covered that in real time, which is very difficult as an anchor. It's really difficult. And I could so relate to that because it reminded me of me back in the day. And her father saw my reporting.
Yes. Andy Parker, yeah.
And we became acquaintances. He appeared on my show a lot. And I'll always remember he approved of our coverage and of my coverage of the event. I always appreciated that about him. And then he went through such a rough time because people can be really cruel. And he became an advocate for gun control and all that stuff. He's still active in that area, fought to get those images of his daughter off the internet. which wasn't easy.
Right.
So that story really stands out in my mind for many reasons. And then the other story that, of course, affected me was the subject of my podcast, Blind Rage, which I covered as a young reporter, where this woman was carjacked, raped repeatedly. Her attacker blinded her so she couldn't identify him. He tied her up and put her in the car and set the car on fire, and off he ran. And somehow this woman found the will to survive. And not only that, but the will to become a part of the investigative team investigating our case. And then she became an advocate for the victims of sexual assault and the blind. So that story stuck with me for 30 years. And I kept in touch with Phyllis Cottle off and on for all of those years until she died.
So
2013, yeah.
Phyllis's story, which is unbelievably dramatic, and even when you give us the capsule version of what happened to her, we're both wincing because it's just such a difficult thing to listen to, as well as for you to report. It seems like that one was one that just stayed with you, and so when you decided, I'm going to do a true crime podcast, I want to tell Phyllis's story.
Yep.
It wasn't the other way around, though. It wasn't, I need to start a podcast in order to tell Phyllis's story.
I've always wanted to tell Phyllis's story, and I started to write a book, and you just don't have time because I was working. And it just so happened when I retired, podcasting was it. And what a great way to share such an impactful story. I think the reason that Phyllis's story stuck with me is I covered that case when I was 22 years old.
Wow.
I had no idea what I was doing, like none. And I was tasked with trying to get an interview from a victim of trauma, especially that kind of trauma. I was tasked with covering that sort of crime that I didn't think was even possible for that kind of evil to walk the earth. And then to figure out the investigative process and how to get information, and then the trial. I was learning in real time, and I was dealing with people's emotions while learning in real time. And I made mistakes. And I think that's part of the reason that story stuck with me as well.
You were pretty much fresh out of Kent State at that point, weren't you?
I was a senior in college.
Wow.
It was crazy.
How old would Phyllis have been at the time of her attack?
She was 44. So it's like my mom, right?
Yeah. She must have picked up on immediately on the fact that you were a cub reporter, with all due respect.
She never said that. And I think Phyllis was such an unusual person. She probably secretly welcomed that because she found a way to manipulate the media for her own ends. Phyllis was amazing that way. So I'm not sure she would tell me, even if she felt that, because she would say, oh, a young mind. That would be Phyllis.
How do you maintain your journalistic objectivity when you're covering a story that is so personally affecting and personally moving? I don't know that I'd be able to.
It's interesting because and I'll go back to that beginning with Phyllis. She was a very sympathetic victim. You just rooting for her, right? The man who attacked her, Samuel Herring, was a bad dude, really bad. It never occurred to me as a young reporter to try to figure out what made him that way. Because that's a really personal, unusual crime to perpetrate on a stranger, because he didn't know Phyllis. I ask myself today, why didn't I go back and investigate his background? He committed his first crime at the age of 11. How does it happen that he gets no psychological help through all of those years? How does it happen that he goes to prison again and again and is let out early? I never did any of those stories. I only covered it from the emotional aspect, which was Phyllis's story, because that's the story that, and I'm going to sound really crass, but that's the story that sells. As I think back on that now, I was not objective, but no one complained about it because it was a good story. So it's incredibly hard to be objective. I don't believe any reporter is truly objective. I think that's impossible. The things that happen to you in your own life affect the way you tell stories. How you put things in order in the story affects how the story is perceived. So you try your best, but it took me a long time to learn that. When you cover emotionally, just like 9/11, was it possible to be truly objective during that? No, it wasn't. And I wasn't. And by then I was really experienced. So it's really difficult.
Yeah, I love what you just said about the way that you tell a story is affected by how you feel, because that's exactly what I teach my kids in my AP Lang course. And it's so nice to hear it affirmed from somebody that, no, I'm not just spouting teacherly BS. It's actually true. It works in the real world.
It is actually true.
Do you think your employers would have given you the real estate to explore those other issues? The things that you're mentioning, Carol, are really important. How does this guy start out his criminal behavior at age 11 and end up going into jail, getting out early, reoffending over and over again? It is a fascinating question about how that happens. Do you think they would have said, oh, sure, go ahead, put in a bunch of time on that? Because isn't Phyllis really the sympathetic person that we can all identify with? It's the there but for the grace of God go I when you hear her story.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And I worked for a very tiny TV station at the time, so they probably would not have allowed the freedom for me to do that. They were concentrating on the fear in the community. How do you keep this from happening to you? So I did a lot of women defense stories and stuff like that. And then you tried to find Phyllis's friends and her family to talk about it and maybe get an interview with Phyllis. My concentration was all that way. And the search for evidence to catch this guy, go down to the police department and establish sources so that you can find out what's happening and beat everyone else to the punch. So you're right. At that time, in that place, in that station, they would have not said, oh, yeah, go find out about the perpetrator. By that time, I think it was such a horrible crime that the entire city just wanted hardcore justice. I don't really care about this person. Don't tell me about this person. I just want him to go away forever. In hindsight, that I don't think that was the right choice as a journalist. We would do that now, right? But there's and I'll ask you about this. So there's a controversy about that. We've had an incredible number of school shootings. Mm-hmm. And at one point when I was at CNN, we decided never to use the alleged perpetrator, the alleged shooter's name.
Right.
Yes.
And we really wouldn't talk about that person very much. And that always bothered me because to me, you have to understand and you have to know and you have to be transparent about what happened in its entirety. And I don't know where the good line is. So I'll ask you guys that. Where do you think that is?
We've both talked about it on the air at Mind Over Murder because obviously we're coming at this from a victim, friend, and family perspective, and we try to be very victim focused. We don't usually identify the offender, although sometimes once or twice. In other words, you have to be clear who it is you're talking about. And these days, sadly, what incident are you discussing? Because there's been so many. But we both lean away from any kind of glorification, which we think is a serious problem in the true crime space. The Washington Post did a cover story a few years ago in the Washington Post magazine about me going to CrimeCon, which is a conference that Kristin and I have attended and spoken at numerous times now. I think there's been 5 of them, Kristin?
Yeah.
One of the things that I found disturbing, and Kristin shares this point of view, and I'll let her speak about it, is that there were people at CrimeCon. There's 5,000 plus fans there who are interested in true crime, consume a lot of true crime media, as well as reporters and investigators and family members. There's a lot of very interesting people there. The thing we found disturbing was people walking around with T-shirts with serial killers' faces on them. So they're, in a sense, they're glorifying Ted Bundy and all of these other sleazeballs who have done terrible things to people. And we think that the focus is in the wrong place. Kristin, what do you think? We've leaned away from too much focus on the offenders.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I remember my very first day at CrimeCon, almost from minute one, I was very disturbed and upset by the fact that I passed a woman who had Ted Bundy's face tattooed on her inner forearm.
No.
And it was like, what? That's definitely not the reason why we should be here. I do think that we have reached a spot within the true crime space where definitely there is glorification of killers that needs to be stopped. The focus does need to be on the victims for sure. Carol, I get your point. Absolutely, that like you do have to explore both sides of the story. And if it comes with something like school shooting, and of course, that's something that's on my mind a lot because I am a teacher. Every day of the working year, I go into my school and wonder, is this going to be the day? And so I think it is important to be able to at least acknowledge this was the impetus behind this. But do we need to say their name? No, not after the first time. And if that person's story or motivation or justification, whatever they think it is, deserves discussion, maybe once, but certainly not over and over. I don't want to see books written about school shooters.
When you addressed CrimeCon and told them, shared these feelings, what was the reception?
Actually, CrimeCon, to be frank, and we're going back again in September in Orlando.
Orlando, yes.
Not my favorite city.
Not our favorite state.
They've actually moved in our direction. As the brother of a murder victim, this is before we did Mind Over Murder, I publicly criticized them and all of the true crime conferences for focus that I thought was not appropriate. And I said, and others too, this isn't a Bill Thomas invention, far from it, I said the focus of these conferences needs to be more on the families and the survivors and the people that we've lost. The focus of a true crime conference should also be on the fact that there are 250,000 cold case homicides in the United States. That's 250,000 people who have died, all of whom had family, friends, schoolmates. So if you think about it, millions of people have been directly touched by this level of violence. That's where the focus needs to be. Over the next couple of years, amazing people like Kim Goldman and Chris Darden and any number of other people that we were just thrilled to just sit in an auditorium and listen to these people present their point of view as the sister of a murder victim from a super high profile case, obviously, as a prosecutor, as investigators, as forensic experts. That is where the focus needs to be. And they invited a lot more families of murder victims, a lot more survivors, which is always really cool when you hear about someone that's survived an attack of this sort. And they shifted the focus. It was really noticeable we didn't go to the first one, but we went to the second one, and it was a really noticeable shift from the second to the third and then on forward. So they did respond. And it wasn't like we were the only ones saying it. We didn't have a podcast at that point, but I talked about it on other people's podcasts, how disturbing we thought it was. The one example that made the Washington Post that they liked and both of us disliked so intensely, we saw a woman at CrimeCon who had made a beautiful handmade skirt. A ton of work had gone into this. Her skirt from top to bottom, which was clearly handmade and quite lovely, it's like a work of art, was all of the faces of all of these serial killers, one after another.
Mugshots.
I can't even
the mugshots of serial killers. And we were like, really?
Yeah.
You spent who knows how many hours sewing this beautiful skirt? That was just an example. And I don't know this woman's name, and I didn't pick her out of a lineup to embarrass her or anything.
He's in a prison visiting a serial killer right now, asking him to marry her.
We've talked about that on Mind Over.
Honestly.
You've got to be kidding. There are people. It's happening now with that moron Brian Kohberger, the suspect in the Idaho 4 case. He's getting love letters from women around the country. Are you serious? You couldn't find another semi-good-looking guy with a square head that isn't in prison? Come on.
And honestly, steering it back just 1 second to the example that Bill was using earlier, I would defy anybody who finds Ted Bundy to be more interesting than hearing the story of Kathy Kleiner Rubin, one of the women who survived the attack by him. The room, you could have heard a pin drop in that room when she was very bravely and for the first time publicly telling what had happened to her. That's the story that you want. And anybody who's, yes, we need another Ted Bundy movie. We need another Ted Bundy documentary. No, you don't. You need a Kathy Kleiner Rubin documentary.
Yeah. She's a rock star in our world.
Actually, when I sat down to write Phyllis's story, I really wanted it to be Phyllis's story. And I wanted her to be present in every episode, right? I wanted her name in there and her actions. Because to me, you're right, the heroes of these crimes are actually the survivors. And not only the fact that they survived this violent thing, this horrible thing that happened to them, but that they're living their lives. And in Phyllis's case, she found a way to go on, be productive, be happy. To me, that is truly heroic.
In the face of that kind of intense trauma, to rise from the ashes like a phoenix, like that's unbelievable.
And then give back and not be bitter, right? I don't know that I could do that. That to me, it's amazing. So I'm so happy to hear you both say that. And I'm so happy that you do your podcast, because that's really what people, I don't know, need to realize, I think. I didn't even watch the Jeffrey Dahmer doc.
No, we have, neither one of us have seen it.
No.
Eventually, at some point, I'll watch it. Although my partner, Pamela, I'm sure will insist that I watch it on my own. She wouldn't see that stuff.
It's repugnant. Iterate for us what your goals are for your podcast. What do you want people to get out of it, other than recognizing the total badassery of Phyllis Cottle, which clearly does need to be recognized? What else would you say your goals are for this?
I actually think the badassery is the prime thing, because I think that there is a perception that women who are victims of crime are weak. We're attacked because we are weak, or we did something wrong and it's our fault. And if only we had fought back or kicked him in the nuts, and it would have been fine. But that's really not the way the world works.
That's right.
So I really wanted the takeaway to be Phyllis Cottle was a badass, even though she was carjacked and assaulted in every way possible and blinded. She never acted as a quote unquote stereotypical victim. She didn't sit in the corner and cry. She became an active participant in solving her case. In fact, the detectives told me that she was a member of the team. And if you just imagine a person reliving their attack over and over again in their brain to remember these tiny details, so she could take them to investigators so that they could solve the case, that in itself is an amazing expression of strength. I wanted to really show that victims of crimes are strong.
I love that.
And it's not their fault. And back in the 80s, a lot of women didn't report rape, just as a lot of women don't report rape today. Somehow, Phyllis was a pioneer in that area, because she was one of the few women at that time that decided to go on television and tell everybody what happened to her in graphic terms. Wow. She didn't hold back. And she came to the conclusion, this is not my fault. I'm not to blame. It was his problem, not my problem. And I want all of you to understand what rape is. I want you to understand what he did and why he has to go away forever. I wanted to, I just wanted to demonstrate to listeners that Phyllis, as a victim of these horrible crimes, was always strong and never weak. And she blamed herself for a time, but then she came to the conclusion that this is bullshit. Two is an expression of strength. I just wanted people to realize that about Phyllis and ultimately about other survivors of crime.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. The footage that you're using, if you will, the audio, it comes from a variety of sources. Did you have difficulty getting the clearances that you wanted to tell the story? Because obviously this happened a number of years ago. How did you go about putting it together using new recordings as well as some recordings from back in the day?
Yeah, when I was thinking of writing a book about it, which was 2004, I recorded Phyllis just on those old-fashioned micro cassette recorders.
Oh, yeah.
But I never really planned to use them professionally. I just wanted to have them for my notes. Sure. So for whatever reason, I kept those all of those years, which was amazing. Some of them had degraded and I couldn't use them. Some of them survived. So the ones, Phyllis's recordings are from 2004. But the rest, I had a friend who's an attorney in Akron, and he helped me contact all of these people associated with the case, and none of them said no.
They all said yes.
Oh,
loved Phyllis Cottle. I can't tell you the charisma that this woman had.
So it wasn't you. I was going to say they must have really liked you. It wasn't you.
No, it was not me. It was definitely Phyllis.
Phyllis.
And they want to keep the man who was convicted of the crime in prison. They don't want him to get out on parole. That's another reason everybody stepped forward. But nobody said no.
Wow.
No one said no. It was amazing.
Is he up for parole at any point soon?
I think in 9 years he will be again.
Okay.
I can picture you speaking out 9 years from now, along with others, but obviously some people will pass on. So it is important. And Phyllis is gone herself, so she can't speak. So it's
and I
important.
think that's a big reason why her family decided to participate. They want to keep their mother's memory alive because she was truly amazing. And number two, they want to keep her wish to keep this guy behind bars. And this is one way they can do that.
Where is he incarcerated now?
In the Ohio Penitentiary. He's been there for 39 years. Every 10 years he comes up. He was sentenced to 299 years, and he was 27 when he was convicted. So he's in his 60s now.
I still don't get the math here. If this guy is sentenced to 299 years, how in the heck is he up for parole every 10? It doesn't even seem to make any sense.
That's what Phyllis's family would say. But yes, every 10 years he comes up, and it's been denied every 10 years because they've gathered thousands of letters from people.
Wow.
How do you like the format of the podcast? Do you feel like the ability to stretch out your storytelling muscles, does that feel good, or is that a challenge?
That was so challenging. Oh my God. Because as a reporter, you're used to writing succinct stories. Like the longest story I ever wrote was like 3 minutes. I did documentary ones, but mostly I wrote 3-minute stories. So doing an episode, 13 minutes was really, and I really had to expand. Let's see, how do I explain this? You have to set the tone and the mood, and you have to describe the scene. And I went through so many documents so that I wouldn't like vary too much from what the truth actually was. So that took a lot of time. And then the crime itself is so brutal, you have to determine how much of it to tell and when and how. That was very difficult. That was really difficult.
I can imagine. So as a professional, what would you say are some of the most important journalistic issues that we need to be focusing on within the true crime space? Now you're here, you're one of us now, and that means our issues are now your issues. What do we need to be focusing on, doing differently or doing better, or what do we need to continue doing that we're doing well already?
There are many excellent true crime podcasts out there, including yours, but there are many not so great true crime podcasts out there that either the hosts read a bunch of newspaper accounts of the crime, read them carefully, and just write a bunch of stuff that's not quite true, or they embellish. It's just wrong. That's not doing your listeners any kind of service. That's just exploiting these victims of crime, to me. I think that podcasters should be very careful in doing their due diligence, because right now, and I teach journalism and I know, young people trust podcasters the most for accurate information, for authenticity. And if we want to keep that, we need to do our due diligence. So I would say that's the most important factor to me, is really knowing your stuff, really doing it in a responsible way, interviewing guests that have credibility and know what they're talking about, trying to fill content because, you know, it's the last minute and you're going to throw a bunch of crap together and get it. That's just not cool, because that's how you lose viewers and that's how you lose trust.
So for those of us who, and I wanted once upon a time, back in the dark ages, I actually wanted to be a journalist, and it never turned out that way. Although, funnily enough, look where I am right now.
I know you would have been a great journalist.
For those of us who haven't been trained, though, in journalism, what are some tips that you have for podcasters and writers who are doing their own research and reporting? What should we be doing better, and what should we not be doing?
I think that it's important to know what a credible source is.
Okay.
I think cross-checking is really important. Like, just because you read it in some newspaper or some random newspaper somewhere, at least you should find another article to cross-check, or call the people in the article. And it just takes time. Take your time, because those things are really important. Cross-check credible sources. What else do I tell my students?
I was going to say, this is crash course in journalism right here for anybody.
Like we're getting a semester's worth of good tips here in less than an hour.
Which is why I'm sitting here taking notes too.
The cool thing about podcasting is you can do long form, so you can really get into it.
Yeah.
You can really educate people in an entertaining kind of way, which is amazing. It's something you really can't do in television news because it's just short pieces. I don't know. A lot of it's so bad now in local news. I find it difficult to talk about. But I think that I tell my students, get to know a detective or two. If you're writing about crime, get to know someone like even a professor who specializes in some facet of criminal justice would be good. Somebody you can bounce things off. Am I going down the right road? Am I thinking about this the right way? Because you get so involved in telling your own story and you fall in love with what you've written, and that's really dangerous. You need that person where you can step back and say, Carol, I don't know if you're going down the right road. I think that's really important to be a really good storyteller, especially when you're telling true stories. Because you do get lost in your own crap, right?
Yes. You can definitely get lost in your own BS, for sure.
Those would be my biggest tips. And don't be afraid to say that you don't know something. Don't be afraid. Don't pretend you know when you don't, because you can't know it all. That's impossible.
And we found, too, that it's real important to develop off-air sources and to understand that, for instance, some of those experts that you might talk to, they might not be in a position to comment on the air about a particular incident or a case they're working. But if you say, look, can we have a conversation that's on background or off the record? Can you tell me, are we on the right track here? Are we asking the right questions, or who should we talk to? And keep it all on background and learn to respect those boundaries. I know Kristin gets on her students about this because she's talked about it on the podcast. We wince when we hear things where we think, this is just a rip and read from Wikipedia, as if Wikipedia is some unassailable source.
Right.
Like you said, do your research. It isn't a matter of 5 minutes before air thinking, oh yeah, I guess I better learn something about this case we're going to be talking about at 4 o'clock.
The other thing is you're writing about real people who've suffered trauma and pain. Don't diss them. You're writing about a real person and something that really happened. And you don't get the luxury of making stuff up about that or doing shoddy work about that. You're doing a disservice to those people. I think that sometimes storytellers forget the human angle, especially when you're working on a true story. Yeah, so Wikipedia is not it.
Definitely agree. So now that you have covered the Phyllis Cottle case, what other stories do you see yourself telling? Now that you've mentioned the Allison Parker case, that would be awesome. Because I remember that. I went to college in Roanoke. And so I remember I was very familiar with that affiliate. And I remember just how absolutely horrified I was when that happened. And I feel like there hasn't been nearly enough coverage of what happened in the aftermath. I'd love to see you do something about Allison Parker. Is that like on the docket, maybe? Want to collaborate?
Yes, that would be amazing.
All right, you two. It sounds great to me.
I mean, I got a whole summer coming up here. Let's do something.
I would love that. That would be so exciting.
All right. What other stories would you like to tell? We'll work that out. But what else would you like to tell your listener?
One of the prosecutors that helped me tell Phyllis's story was named Emily Pelfrey, and she used to be a prosecutor in Ohio. And she has so many interesting cases. Mm-hmm. So I'm mining her brain at the moment. And I'm thinking about telling the story from a prosecutor's angle because you don't hear that often, especially a female prosecutor. She was prosecuting a case that involved a serial killer, and she said she was pregnant at the time, and she didn't want her pregnancy to show because that would project vulnerability in the courtroom, and she needed to be strong. This is one story that intrigued me. And she said, I decided to distract from my baby bump. I would wear the most amazing shoes I could find. That when the jury looked at me, they would just notice my shoes,
really
not that
I'm
a pregnant woman. And she also said she was overly emotional so that when the victim's family members took the stand, she would find herself starting to tear up. And she didn't want people to see that either. So there was all these interesting human elements that went into her preparing that case and how she tried the case. So I'm thinking of telling a story from that angle. from one of
Wow.
in telling the story of her investigating the case from a prosecutorial angle and then actually trying it from a human
That
woman.
would be an amazing story.
That sounds great.
And I'll throw in, I want to watch that television series and I want to see that movie because, man, what an incredible intersection of story elements. And this is her real life.
Yeah, I think that would be really cool. So I'm working on that. I'm also working on a partnership with the Project for the Innocent at Loyola Marymount University. They do great work in our law school, and they have amazing stories to tell. Because I think that the story normally ends when the person gets out of prison after they've been in there for 30 years. But like, what happens then?
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to tell that story as well. And there are just so many great stories down there. So those are the things I'm thinking of to do next.
We shouldn't let this opportunity pass without talking a little bit about your former home, CNN. You mentioned at the top of the podcast, they've been in the news
Yes.
just a little lately. And I asked you off the air and I said, I assume you still have friends there. And you said, yes, a lot of friends, including folks that have been there for a number of years. Can they move forward? And what would you do if they hired you as the CEO?
I think they should, right? I don't know who would want that job.
Oh, I don't know either.
I worked at CNN for almost 20 years, and I experienced lots of ups and downs. And there were times when we had no ratings at all, and I lived through those times. And then there were times when we had great ratings, and those were the heydays. Those were fun. So I don't think CNN is dead and gone by any stretch of the imagination. I think that people like to talk about CNN a lot because it's just become this hot button issue when it comes to all things journalism that I think is unfair. So Chris Licht did not do a good job, which is why he was eventually fired. I hope they bring in somebody who is better suited to run a large organization like CNN in the times we live in today, which are so different from when I started at CNN 20 years ago. I'm not sure that viewers are interested in seeing a centrist product. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't see it right now. We live in a world that's so complicated that I'm not sure that you can present a story that makes everybody happy, because the stories are mostly boring and don't really reflect what's going on in the world. So I think that CNN is going to have to do some deep soul searching and decide what it wants to be, really wants to be, what its audience wants it to be. And we have a very fraught election coming up, and it's got to figure out how to cover that election more effectively than its first foray under Chris Licht.
I'd have to agree. They're going to have challenges. And as I said at the beginning, when we were just chatting before we started, I'm not sure I would have announced, oh, we're tacking to the center. I might have just tried it. The other thing is, I think trying to be all things to all people is completely impossible.
Yeah.
I do think adherence to the truth is really important, and I think they should be challenging all of the political figures that they cover, and they don't just cover politics, of course. That's actually something they seem to have forgotten about. One of CNN's great strengths was these incredible reporters and producers across the country and around the world. Remember, CNN was the go-to place whenever there was something really important happening, particularly at an international location, but nationally as well. They seem to have lost sight of all of that. I don't think Chris Licht was a good choice. The skill set, though, of someone that can run an organization of that scale and be effective, that's not a long list of people that have that kind of resume.
True. You have 4,000 people, many of whom are based in other parts of the world. You have the advertising space. There are just so many things when you're running a network to take into account besides journalism and the way we do news. So you have all of that. But I think that journalism is in a precarious state right now. You also have that. So you're dealing with all these issues all at once when everybody complains about you and everybody has an opinion about how journalism should be done. Everybody does, even if they've never done it in their entire lives. So you have to be the kind of manager that can block out the noise and have a concrete direction. And you have to communicate that to your staff. Journalists, we're not pushovers. No. We don't just take the boss's word and say, oh, yeah, I'll go do that, unless we really respect them. And they prove to us that they have the wherewithal to handle the job. Otherwise, they're going to go do what they want. or the product's going to be like not what you want it to be because they're not going to be putting in their best effort because they're going to be confused.
That was one of the takeaways from the Atlantic article, which was amazing. I literally couldn't put it down. I kept reading and thinking, gosh, this is great. And it's really long. And I didn't realize it was 15,000 words when I sat down.
The exercise session with the guy with the pajama bottoms and the polka dot shirt, and he was like making Chris look that was bizarre.
Oh, giving a reporter that level of access for that long isn't probably a great idea.
Oh, God. That's ew. Why would you even bring the reporter to your exercise session? Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. But I think that Chris Lick, it seemed so anyway, that he was, I don't know, he wanted to improve his public image. And maybe he thought that would, if his public image improved, that would improve things with the staff. But that's really not the way it works. Plus, I work for Jeff Zucker. Yeah. I loved him.
I was going to say, Zucker had an understanding with the people that worked for him. I'm not saying everybody loved the guy, but they felt like he was in their corner and that he really understood how to work with talent, not a word I care much for, but all of these talented producers and writers, and most importantly, the on-air reporters.
I'll tell you how close he was. So the news desk is in the middle of the newsroom at CNN New York. So I would anchor the news. I could see Jeff Zucker's office from the news desk. It was just right across the way. And in commercial breaks, if he noticed, and he was watching me. So that told me like he cared about what I was doing.
Yeah, exactly. It meant a lot to him.
So in breaks, he would sometimes come out of his office and say, you know what, when this other person comes up, you probably should ask this, see if this like tactic works. And I appreciated that because most times he was absolutely right. It is difficult to be on the air for 2 hours in a live broadcast, especially with the election of 2016 when you had to catch inaccuracies in real time. That's really hard.
Yeah.
Because for a brief moment, your brain says, is that really true? And then you like have to summon the information, the true information, like that.
Right.
Everybody thinks the producer like feeds us info, but they can't even keep up. So it was comforting to have Jeff Zucker right there.
I'm picturing Aaron Sorkin's The Newsroom and superimposing your face as that's happening, because that sounds exactly like what they did on the episodes where they covered the election. That's my only frame of reference for this right at the moment.
So the stuff was so out there. You're like, am I the crazy one? I know. So I don't know. Jeff Zucker was very connected to the staff and not just talent, but you're right, the producers. He had a game plan every morning. You understood what direction the network was going that particular day. We were all on board because it was brilliant most times. I know that CNN did a lot of things wrong with the election of 2016, but it did try to right itself. And I think that people forget that was an election like no other. And this election coming up will be an election like no other. It'll just be weird in many respects and disturbing in many respects. So you're figuring out as a news manager how to cover it in real time. It's not like you get a bunch of time to sit around with your pals and say, how should we cover this weird shit that's happening? This weird shit happens in real time. And you want to get it right. And sometimes you do and sometimes you don't, because news managers are human too. But you want a news manager who gets it right most of the time in the moment. And that was not Chris Licht.
No, it's going to be a big shoes to fill. It really is.
Yeah.
So I gather then you don't miss getting up at 3:00 in the morning or whatever to be on the air.
I thought that forevermore I would wake up at 2:30 in the morning, but that's not true because the day I left CN, I slept until 10. My body snapped right back to normal.
Yeah, I wake up at 4:30 every morning so that I can get ready, and then I've got a half-hour drive to school. And as soon as I don't have to set that alarm for the summer, I will do exactly the same thing. 10 o'clock in the morning. Don't call me before then. Don't do it.
Exactly. funny how you can like actually function with brain fog, right? Because I'm sure you have brain fog waking up at 4:30 in the morning.
Yes. And honestly, for the first time ever this morning, and I'm uber organized, Bill will tell you that. For the first time ever, I actually managed to walk out of my house without my lunch this morning. And it wasn't until I got to school 30 minutes later and I realized, oh my God, I don't have anything to eat for today. I have never had that happen before, but the end of year teacher tired brain fog is so real, and it's like we're on it.
And can I just say teachers are amazing.
Thank you.
Especially now when they're under attack from so many different places. I think that it's difficult enough to teach, but to deal with all the other stuff that's going on right now, and you're hanging in there and continuing to do it and care about your students, that's amazing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Carol, tell our listeners where they can tune into your podcast.
You can catch Carol Costello Presents Blind Rage wherever you get your podcasts. I had just started a new Facebook page, facebook.com/CarolLMU. We can start a conversation there. That would be terrific. Or Instagram, and I think it's just at Carol Costello. Blind Rage, you can get it wherever you get your podcasts. And please listen, because I want to do the greatest service I can to Phyllis Cottle, because she was truly an amazing woman, and her story has to be shared.
And we will put links to all of that in our show notes. Carol, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for doing what you do.
That's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.